The lawyer, a kind but formal man named Mr. Albright, cleared his throat. The sound echoed in the sterile, wood-paneled conference room, a room that smelled of expensive leather and ambition. My children, Peter and Mary, sat opposite me at the vast, polished table. This meeting had been my idea, a day I had been planning and saving for, in one way or another, for my entire adult life. It was supposed to be a day of revelation, of joy, the culmination of a lifetime of silent sacrifice. And so, Mr. Albright announced, looking at a final summary sheet in the file before him, after a lifetime of diligent, careful saving and shrewd investing of those savings, your mother, Agnes, has amassed a total estate valued at $1,512,000 to be shared equally between you. The number fell into the silent room. $1.5 million. To me, it was a breathtaking figure, an impossible sum, a mountain built of pennies and prayers. It was the total of every new dress I never bought, every vacation I never took, every small pleasure I had denied myself for 50 years. It was the sound of my love. I looked at my children, my heart pounding in my chest, my hands trembling in my lap. I waited for their reaction. I expected gasps. I expected tears of gratitude. I expected them to finally understand. Instead, a strange flat silence descended. Mary, my daughter, a successful marketing executive who wore a watch that probably cost more than my first car, simply sighed. It was a sigh of weary impatience. She subtly, almost imperceptibly, checked the time on that expensive watch. Peter, my son, a man who prided himself on his golf handicap and his corner office, ran a hand through his perfectly styled silver hair. He looked not at me, but at the lawyer. $1.5 million, he said, and his voice held no joy, no shock, only a vague, mild surprise, as if he'd just been told the weather forecast. Wow, okay, that's nice, Mom. Really? He then turned his focus back to Mr. Albright. So, can we wrap this up? I have a 2:00 tea time at the club, and the traffic can be a real bear. And in that moment, under the fluorescent glare of that cold, impersonal room, my entire life's work, my great act of maternal sacrifice, didn't feel heroic. It felt foolish. The 40 years I had spent darning old socks until they were more thread than sock, the decades of eating leftover scraps for dinner, the lifetime of turning my back on every small, beautiful, fleeting pleasure the world had to offer. It all collapsed in on itself. It wasn't a grand gift of love. It was the punchline to a long, sad joke, and I was the only one who hadn't been in on it. Hi everyone, I'm Grandma Agnes. I'm 79 years old, and I have just discovered that the great fortune I spent my life building for my children is something they see as little more than a slight delay in their afternoon schedule. The secret I am sharing with you today is not that I had the money. The secret is the story of the money itself. It's the story of what each and every one of those pennies truly cost. My children live in a world of effortless transactions, of credit cards and online banking. They see money as an abstract concept, a tool for acquiring things. They have no idea that for me, money was never abstract. It was real. It was tangible. It was the ache in my back after a 12-hour shift, the burn of a needle in my finger, the gnawing emptiness in my stomach when I gave my portion of dinner to my husband because he'd worked a double shift. They see a number on a page. I see a lifetime of ghosts. The ghost of a new winter coat I never bought, choosing instead to patch my old one again. The ghost of a trip to the seaside I never took, choosing instead to put that money into their college fund. The ghost of every movie, every dinner out, every small, frivolous joy I watched other people enjoy, while I stood on the other side of the glass, diligently, quietly, lovingly, saving for them. This is the story of what happens when a gift that cost everything is received, as if it cost nothing. So please settle in. This is a difficult story to tell, a story of a mother's love and a generation's indifference. Your presence here, your likes and your subscriptions to Grandmother's Diary give me the strength to count the true cost of my life's work. My story is not written in grand adventures or colorful photographs. It is written in the faint, spidery script of old account ledgers, in the worn-out soles of 10-year-old shoes, and in the quiet, echoing spaces of a life lived for others. To understand why I would spend 50 years denying myself, you must first understand the world that made me. A world of cold floors, thin blankets, and the constant, gnawing fear of not having enough. I was a child of the Great Depression. That's not a phrase from a history book to me. It's the taste of watery soup and the feeling of a stomach that was never quite full. I remember my father, a good, strong man, coming home day after day, his face etched with the shame of having no work. I remember my mother, silently cutting a single potato into 5 thin slices to feed our family for a day. The greatest luxury in our house was the absence of worry, a luxury we rarely enjoyed. I learned early that money wasn't about buying things. It was about security. It was the wall that stood between your family and the cold, howling wind of poverty. And I swore to myself, as a little girl shivering under a thin blanket, that when I had a family of my own, I would build them a fortress of security so high and so strong that no cold wind could ever touch them. I married a man who understood. My Arthur was a man cut from the same cloth. He grew up in a similar world of scarcity and hard work. He was a postman, a steady, reliable job, but not one that would ever make us rich. We were a team in frugality. Our romance was not written in candlelit dinners, but in the shared satisfaction of a balanced checkbook. "A penny saved is a penny earned" was not just a motto. It was the gospel we lived by. We packed our lunches every day. We mended our clothes until they were more patched than fabric. We celebrated our wedding anniversary with a walk in the park and a shared thermos of coffee, not with champagne and expensive gifts. We weren't miserable. We were happy. Our happiness was a quiet, sturdy thing, built not on what we had, but on what we were building for the future, for our children. We raised Peter and Mary in this world of careful, deliberate saving. They had everything they needed: a warm home, good food, sturdy clothes, and an abundance of love. But they never had what we wanted. They wore hand-me-downs from their older cousins. Their toys were often second-hand, carefully repaired and repainted by their father in our small garage. They never had the latest trendy sneakers or the popular brand-name jeans their friends all wore. Our life was a constant, gentle litany of, "We can't afford that," or "We can make that ourselves for cheaper," or "Maybe for your birthday, if we save up." I know it was hard on them. I remember one afternoon, when Mary was about 11. A group of her popular, pretty friends came over to play. They stood in our simple, slightly shabby living room, their eyes taking in our worn-out sofa and our old black-and-white television. I brought them a plate of homemade cookies, and I heard one of the girls whisper to another, "Are they poor?" The look of hot, burning shame on my daughter's face is a memory I will take to my grave. She rushed her friends out of the house and refused to speak to me for the rest of the evening. I knew I was hurting her. But in my mind, that small, present hurt was a necessary sacrifice for a greater future good. I was saving her from the real poverty, the poverty of fear, the poverty of hunger. I didn't realize that I was creating in my children a different kind of hunger, a desperate, ravenous hunger to escape the very world of scrimping and saving I was so painstakingly building for their benefit. As soon as they were old enough, they fled. They fled my world of practicality and embraced a new world of consumerism with a vengeance. They both got scholarships to good universities, a feat made possible by the fact that they didn't have to worry about student loans, thanks to the coffee cans of cash their father and I had saved. They both got high-paying jobs in the city, and they began to spend. Oh, how they spent. It was as if they were making up for a lifetime of deprivation. Peter, my son, became a man defined by his possessions. The German car, the designer suits, the exclusive country club membership. He married a woman just like him, and they built a life that was a perfect, glossy advertisement for success. Mary, my daughter, curated her life like a magazine spread. Her perfect apartment with its minimalist furniture, her exotic vacations to places I had only ever seen in National Geographic, her wardrobe of clothes that were worn once, and then discarded. Their success should have been my greatest joy. And it was, in a way. But it came with a new, strange kind of pain. They loved me, I believe, in their own way. But they were deeply, profoundly ashamed of me. They were ashamed of my simple apartment with its mismatched second-hand furniture. They were ashamed of my darned sweaters and my sensible 10-year-old shoes. They were ashamed of my entire way of life, a life they saw not as a noble sacrifice, but as a sad, miserly existence. The disdain was never overt, but it was always there, in 1,000 tiny cuts. They stopped inviting me to their homes for dinner parties with their important friends. When we did go out to a restaurant, a rare occasion, Peter would snatch the bill from my hand before I could even look at it, a flush of embarrassment on his face at the thought of his mother carefully counting out her cash. Mary would visit me, and I would see her eyes scanning my apartment, a look of pity and distaste on her face. Once she tried to help me by bringing over a bag of her expensive cast-off designer clothes. "Mom," she'd said, "you can't keep wearing these old things. You have to at least try to look presentable." She didn't understand that my old things were a badge of honor, a testament to a promise I was keeping. They saw my frugality as a personal failing, a strange, embarrassing quirk they had to manage. They never once stopped to ask me why. Why I still reused tea bags. Why I still patched my own clothes. Why my greatest pleasure was seeing a high interest rate on a certificate of deposit. They never understood that every penny I saved, every small pleasure I denied myself, was a love letter to them. It was a tangible piece of my heart, deposited into an account that bore their names. They didn't see the love. They just saw the poverty. A poverty they had run from their whole lives, and a poverty they wanted nothing to do with, even now. And I, in my foolish, silent love, had let them believe it. I had never explained the why. I just assumed that one day, when the gift was finally given, they would understand. I never imagined that the gift itself would mean so little. I don't remember leaving the lawyer's office. I don't remember the elevator ride down, or the walk through the marble-floored lobby. My body moved, but my soul had remained behind, a ghost still sitting at that polished table, staring at the indifferent faces of my children. My next clear memory is of standing in front of my own apartment building, the key in my hand, fumbling with the lock as if it were a foreign object. The journey home must have been on autopilot, my mind a thick, gray fog of shock, and a shame so profound it felt like a physical illness. The shame was not for my simple life, but for my grand, foolish assumption. I had spent 50 years composing a love letter, and when I finally delivered it, I discovered my children were illiterate in the language of sacrifice. They couldn't read the words written in my worn-out shoes and my patched-up coat. They only saw the final disappointing number at the bottom of the page. I let myself into my quiet apartment. The air was still and smelled of the lemon polish I used once a week. Everything was in its place. The darned doilies on the arms of my worn-out chair, the faded photograph of my Arthur on the mantelpiece, the neat stack of library books on the coffee table. This was the command center of my life's great project of saving. This was the frugal, quiet fortress I had built. And in the silence of that afternoon, it no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like a prison I had built for myself, brick by brick, penny by penny. I sat in my armchair, the one with the springs that groaned in sympathy whenever I sat down, and I let the full weight of their reaction wash over me. Peter's bored impatience, Mary's weary sigh, the way they had looked at the lawyer, not at me, as if I were merely the inconvenient vessel for the assets being discussed. They hadn't been cruel. Cruelty would have been easier to bear. Cruelty implies passion, engagement. This was something far worse. It was a complete and utter indifference. My life's great sacrifice wasn't a tragedy to them. It was a tedious administrative task, an item on their to-do list to be checked off before moving on to more important things, like a 2 o'clock tea time. The ghosts I lived with, the ghosts of the things I had denied myself, rose up around me in the quiet room. The ghost of a warm, stylish winter coat, the one I had admired in a department store window 15 years ago. I had stood there for a full 10 minutes, my hand on the cold glass, imagining the feel of the soft wool. But it had cost $80. $80 was a week's worth of groceries. It was a significant deposit into Peter's college fund. So I had walked away, pulling my own thin patched coat tighter around me. The ghost of a trip to the ocean. Arthur and I had always dreamed of seeing the ocean together. After he died, I kept a brochure for a small seaside town in Maine, tucked away in my dresser drawer. For years, I would take it out and look at the pictures of the rocky coastline and the quaint little fishing boats. A week there, in a modest guest house, would have cost $300. But $300 was the price of a new set of tires for Mary's first car. So the brochure had stayed in the drawer, its corners soft and worn from years of hopeful, futile handling. The room was filled with them, a silent, reproachful crowd of all the small, beautiful joys I had traded for their future. And for what? For a sigh? For a glance at a watch? The phone rang, shrill and startling in the silent apartment. It was Mary. My heart gave a painful, hopeful leap. Maybe, a foolish part of me whispered, maybe it has sunk in. Maybe she's calling to apologize. "Hi, Mom," she said, her voice brisk, efficient. The voice of a woman clearing her desk at the end of a long day. "Listen, I was just talking to Peter. About the meeting today." "Danda, Kaja." "Yes," I said, my voice a small, tight knot. "We were just thinking," she continued, "that it would probably be best if you just had Mr. Albright's office wire the funds directly to our bank accounts. It would be cleaner that way. Less paperwork for you to worry about. If you could just call him tomorrow and give him the authorization, we'd appreciate it." I couldn't breathe. There was no apology. There was no gratitude. There was only logistics. The cold, efficient cleanup after the boring administrative task was complete. They weren't just indifferent to my sacrifice. They were actively trying to expedite its conclusion so they could get on with their lives. "Is that all, Mary?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "Yeah, that's it," she said, oblivious. "Oh, and Peter said to thank you again. It was very nice of you. Okay, gotta run. Talk to you soon." She hung up. I placed the receiver back in its cradle with a hand that was now perfectly icily steady. The last flickering ember of my hope had been extinguished. The foolish part of me that had been waiting for a thank you was finally, blessedly, dead. And in its place, something new was born. It was not anger. It was a strange, terrifying, and exhilarating sense of freedom. The contract I had made with myself 50 years ago, the vow to sacrifice everything for them, was null and void. The project was complete. The fortress of security had been built. And its occupants didn't care. They didn't want the fortress. They just wanted to strip it for parts. I stood up and walked over to the small mahogany desk where I had spent so many thousands of hours hunched over my account ledgers. For my entire life, this desk had been a place of denial, a place of subtraction, a place where I calculated what I could live without. Tonight, for the very first time, I was going to use it for addition. I pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and a pen. At the top, I wrote, "Things Agnes wants." The first entry was easy. I wrote, a new winter coat, a warm, stylish wool one. Not in a sensible color like gray or navy. In red, a bright, joyful, unapologetic red. The second came just as quickly. A trip to the ocean, to that little town in Maine, for a full week, in a room with a view of the water. Then the floodgates opened. The ghosts that had haunted me began to transform into a list of possibilities. Weekly dinners at a nice restaurant. Not a fancy one, just a place with cloth napkins and food I didn't have to cook myself. Tickets to the symphony. A comfortable new armchair, one that doesn't groan. A real haircut from a proper salon, not just a trim I do myself in the bathroom mirror. A new mattress. A color television. The list grew, a litany of small, ordinary human pleasures that I had denied myself for half a century. It was a declaration of independence, a reclamation of a life I had voluntarily put on hold. As I wrote, I felt a strange, unfamiliar giddiness. I felt like a prisoner who has just discovered the cell door was unlocked the entire time. The next morning, I woke up with a purpose that had nothing to do with saving and everything to do with living. I did not call Mr. Albright to authorize the transfer of funds. Instead, I put on my best, patched-up coat, took the bus downtown, and walked into the most expensive department store in the city. The air inside smelled of perfume and leather. Soft, classical music played from hidden speakers. Beautifully dressed women glided past me, their faces serene and untroubled. For my entire life, a place like this had been an alien landscape, a place I hurried past on my way to scrub its customers' floors. Today, I walked in as if I owned it. I found the coat department, and there it was, a coat the color of a perfect ripe apple. It was made of a soft, thick cashmere that felt like a hug. It had a stylish cut and a simple, elegant collar. I looked at the price tag. It was $400. The old Agnes, the ghost at my shoulder, gasped in horror. $400! That was more than my monthly food budget. That was a fortune. But the new Agnes, the woman with the list in her pocket, simply smiled. I found a saleswoman, a young woman with kind eyes. "I'd like to try this on, please," I said, my voice clear and strong. I slipped the coat on. It was like sliding into a new skin. It was warm. It was beautiful. It made me feel visible. I looked at myself in the three-way mirror. I didn't see a tired, frugal old woman. I saw a woman on the verge of a new adventure. "I'll take it," I said. I walked to the register and paid for it with a check from the account that held the sum of all my denials. The saleswoman wrapped it beautifully in a large, glossy box with a ribbon. I walked out of the store, holding my prize, and I did something I hadn't done in 50 years. I hailed a taxi. I didn't take the bus. I took a taxi home. It was a small, extravagant, and utterly joyful act of rebellion. When I got home, the phone was ringing. It was Peter. "Mom," he said, his voice tight with a strange, anxious energy. I just checked my bank account. The wire transfer hasn't come through yet." "Did you call Albright?" "No, dear, I haven't," I said, my voice cheerful as I unwrapped my beautiful new coat. "But I've been out shopping." There was a stunned silence on the other end. "Shopping?" he repeated, as if I had just told him I had taken up skydiving. "Shopping for what?" "A new coat," I said. "A red one. It's absolutely beautiful. It cost $400 to buy." The silence that followed was different from the silence in the lawyer's office. That had been the silence of indifference. This was the silence of pure, panicked disbelief. I could almost hear the gears grinding in his head. $400 on a coat. That's my money. That's our money. What is she doing? $400? He stammered. "Mom, are you feeling okay?" "I'm feeling wonderful, Peter," I said, stroking the soft cashmere. "Absolutely wonderful. In fact, I'm just looking at a brochure for a little trip I'm planning, to the seaside, in Maine. I think I'll go next month, when the leaves start to turn." I didn't need to see his face to know the expression on it. The dawning horror, the greedy panic, the sudden, terrifying realization that the Bank of Mom, which he had thought was simply transitioning into a trust fund, might have other plans. The quiet, predictable, frugal little old woman he had so easily dismissed was suddenly, inexplicably, spending his inheritance. "Mom," he said, his voice a strangled whisper. I think we need to talk." "I agree, Peter," I said, smiling into the phone. "I think we do. Let's have lunch next week. We can go to that nice Italian place downtown. My treat." I hung up the phone, my heart not pounding with fear, but with a slow, steady, and powerful beat. The game had changed. I had spent a lifetime teaching them that my love meant saving. Now, I was going to have to teach them that my love and my money had a value they had never even begun to comprehend. And the first lesson was about to begin. The Italian restaurant was a place I had walked past 1,000 times, always on the other side of the street, always on my way to somewhere less beautiful. It had a dark green awning and little tables on the sidewalk with checkered tablecloths. It always smelled of garlic and baking bread, a scent of leisurely, expensive pleasure. Today, I walked through its front door, not as a passerby, but as a patron. I was early. I chose a table in the corner, one with a plush, red velvet banquet. When the waiter came, a young man with a kind smile, I did not ask for a glass of water. I ordered a glass of Chianti, a wine I had only ever read about in books. When it arrived, a deep, beautiful ruby red in a large, sparkling glass, I held it up to the light and I toasted the woman I was becoming. The wine was dry and warm, and it tasted of a world I was finally allowing myself to enter. My children arrived together, a united front of anxiety. They saw me, sitting alone with my glass of wine, and the confusion on their faces was a small, satisfying victory. I was not the woman they were expecting. I was not the harried, apologetic mother they had planned to manage. "Mom," Mary said, sliding into the booth opposite me. "You're drinking wine." She said it as if she had just discovered I was juggling knives. "Yes, dear," I said, taking a slow, deliberate sip. "It's lovely. You should try some." Peter sat beside her, his face a tight mask of controlled frustration. "Mom, we need to talk about this. This spending, the coat, the trip to Maine. It's not like you. It's irresponsible." "Irresponsible?" I asked, my voice genuinely curious. What an interesting choice of word. For 50 years, I was the most responsible person you knew. I was responsible for your food, your clothes, your education, your future. It seems rather unfair that I'm not now allowed to be responsible for my own joy. The waiter returned to take our order. I ordered the lobster ravioli, a most expensive pasta dish on the menu. My children exchanged another panicked look and ordered simple salads. The power dynamic was so new, so utterly reversed, that it had stolen their appetites. We ate in a tense silence for a few minutes. They were waiting for me to explain myself, to justify my new, alarming behavior. I let them wait. I savored my ravioli, each bite a small, perfect explosion of flavor. It was the best thing I had eaten in my entire life. Finally, Peter could stand it no longer. "Mom, about the money," he began, putting down his fork. "Mr. Albright said it's $1.5 million. That's a lot of money. It needs to be managed properly, invested, for the future." "For your future, you mean?" I said, dabbing my lips with a cloth napkin. "Of course for our future," he said, his voice rising with exasperation. "That's what you've always wanted. That's what this was all for, wasn't it?" "Yes, Peter," I said. "It was. But I've come to realize that the gift I was giving you was incomplete. I gave you the money, but I never gave you the story that came with it. I never gave you the understanding of its true cost. And without that, the money is meaningless. It's just paper. So, I've decided to amend the terms of my gift." "Nothing, Asidier." I reached into my handbag, the new, stylish leather one I had bought after the coat, and I pulled out a folder. I slid it across the table. "I'm still going to give you your inheritance," I said. "Most of it anyway. But not as a simple wire transfer. You are going to earn it. Not with work, but with understanding." "Come on." They stared at the folder as if it were a box of snakes. Mary slowly opened it. Inside there were several documents, neatly typed. "I call this," I explained, my voice calm and steady, "the Agnes Peterson Legacy Project. It has 3 parts. The first part," I said, pointing to the top document, "is what I call the sacrifice ledger. It's an accounting of my life. Not in dollars, but in choices. I've spent the last week going through my old diaries and account books. I have calculated the approximate cost, in time and labor and denial, of every major expense I covered for you. For example, you will see an entry for Peter's first bicycle, 1975. The cost was not $30. The cost was 62 hours of extra sewing alterations, which resulted in a case of acute tendinitis in my right hand that lasted for 3 months. You will see an entry for Mary's braces, 1982. The cost was not $2,000. The cost was 154 extra weekend shifts at the diner, which meant 154 days where I did not get to see my own children, except when they were sleeping. I watched their faces as they scanned the document. I saw the color drain from Mary's cheeks. I saw a muscle begin to twitch in Peter's jaw. The ledger went on for 10 pages. A meticulous, brutal accounting of a lifetime of love. To receive your inheritance, I said, you will both be required to review this ledger in its entirety. You will then sign the final page, acknowledging that you have read it and that you understand the true cost of the funds you are about to receive. It is a non-negotiable first step. I let that sink in. The silence was thick with their shock and dawning horror. The second part, I continued, relentless, is the story project. For 1 year, you will spend 1 full weekend a month with me. Not a brief, dutiful visit. A full weekend. And during that time, we will work together on a project. You will help me write my life story. You will not just hear the stories, you will record them. You will ask me questions. You will listen. You will learn about the girl who grew up in the Depression, the young woman who fell in love with your father, the widow who scrubbed floors and sewed until her fingers bled. You will learn the story of the woman whose life you were so quick to dismiss. A weekend a month? Peter sputtered. Mom, I have a life. I have my golf club, my commitments. Yes, you do, Peter, I said. And for 1 weekend a month, your commitment will be to me, to the woman who gave you that life. It is, again, non-negotiable. And finally, I said, my voice softening slightly, there is the third part, the Joyful Noise Trust. I pushed another document towards them. I have instructed Mr. Albright to place 1/3 of my estate, $500,000, into a separate trust. This money is not for you. It is for me. It is my joy fund. It is the fund for all the coats and trips and concerts and dinners that I denied myself for 50 years. And you two, I said, looking them both directly in the eye, are going to be the trustees. What? Mary whispered, her face a mask of disbelief. As trustees, I explained, you will be legally obligated to manage this fund for my sole benefit. I will submit my requests to you in writing. A trip to Italy. A new, comfortable mattress. A front row ticket to the symphony. And you will be required to approve the expenditure and release the funds. You will, in essence, be forced to watch me, month after month, spend your inheritance on my own happiness. You will be forced to participate in the joy you never knew I had sacrificed. 9. I leaned back against the plush velvet of the banquette. I had laid it all out. The trap was not a cage of denial, but a cage of understanding. They could have the money. But to get it, they would have to walk through the fire of my life. They would have to feel the burn of my sacrifice. They would have to look me in the eye and acknowledge the true price of their comfort. Peter just stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. But Mary, my daughter, my pragmatic, unsentimental marketing executive, finally found her voice. This is blackmail, she hissed, her voice trembling with a furious, impotent rage. This is a cruel, manipulative game. No, my dear, I said, and I smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached my eyes for the first time in decades. Blackmail is when you demand something for nothing. I am simply, finally, showing you the price tag. This is not a game. This is the cost of doing business, the business of being my children. I placed a $50 bill on the table to cover my lunch. It was more than enough. I stood up, my legs steady, my heart calm. I looked down at my 2 stunned, silent, beautiful children. They looked so lost. You have 1 week to decide, I said. If you agree to the terms, call Mr. Albright. If you do not, he has been instructed to transfer the entire estate into a charitable trust for the benefit of stray cats. I'm told they are far more grateful. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have an appointment to get my hair done." And I turned and walked out of the restaurant. I did not look back. I walked out into the bright, cold afternoon sun, leaving them there in the plush, quiet restaurant, with the ghosts of my life laid bare on the table between them. The choice was now theirs. They could have the money, or they could have their ignorance. But for the first time in their lives, they could not have both. The week that followed our lunch was the quietest week of my life. The silence from my children was a living entity, a heavy, suffocating blanket of their indecision. I knew they were talking to each other, their phone calls a frantic, panicked flurry of strategy and recrimination. I could almost hear their conversations. Can she do this? Is it legal? What if we just say no? But the cats! We can't let her give $1 million to a bunch of stray cats. I, in the meantime, lived. I wore my beautiful red coat every single day. I took walks in the park. I went to the library. I sat in cafes, drinking real cappuccinos and reading my books, a quiet, smiling woman in a red coat. A woman who looked, for the first time in her life, like she had nowhere else she needed to be. I did not wait by the phone. I had given them their choice, and I was, for the first time, at peace with the outcome, whatever it might be. If they chose the money, I would gain a chance to reclaim my children. If they chose their pride, I would gain $1.5 million to spend on stray cats and my own adventures. It was, I realized with a startling clarity, a win-win situation. On the 7th day, just hours before the deadline I had given them, Mr. Albright called. "Agnes," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "They've agreed, all of them. They've signed the agreement for the Legacy Project." And so, it began. The first weekend of the story project was a masterpiece of awkward, resentful silence. They arrived at my apartment on Saturday morning, their faces grim, their bodies radiating a tense, coiled anger. They looked like two sullen teenagers who had been grounded. "So," Peter said, looking around my small living room as if it were a prison cell. "What do you want to do?" "Right. First," I said cheerfully, "we are going to clean out the hall closet. It's been a mess for 30 years. Their faces fell. This was not what they had envisioned. They had imagined a weekend of sitting on my sofa, passively listening to a few old stories while they checked their phones. They had not imagined manual labor. For 2 hours, we worked in silence. We pulled out old coats, mismatched boots, and boxes of dusty photo albums. But as we worked, something began to shift. Mary found a tiny pair of red rubber boots. "Oh my God," she whispered, holding them in her hands. "I remember these. I loved these boots. I cried for a week when I outgrew them." "Nah." "I remember," I said. "You insisted on wearing them even when your toes were cramped. Your father had to hide them from you." Peter unearthed a box of his old Boy Scout badges. He ran his fingers over the faded, embroidered patches. "I was so proud of this one," he said, pointing to a small circular badge for fire making. "It took me 6 tries to get it right." The stories began to trickle out, small, hesitant springs of memory in the dry desert of their resentment. We didn't write my life story that weekend. We just began to unearth the artifacts of theirs. When they left on Sunday evening, they were still sullen, but something had changed. The anger was still there, but it was now mixed with a new, unsettling emotion. The ghost of a memory of a time when they had been a part of something other than their own ambition. The second part of the project began the following week, the Joyful Noise Trust. My first request to my new trustees was a simple one. I submitted a formal, written request for $1,200 for a new mattress. The phone call from Peter was almost immediate. "A mattress? Mom, $1,200 for a mattress? That's insane. You can get a perfectly good one for $300. I don't want a perfectly good one, Peter," I said calmly. "I want a magnificent one, the kind they have in fancy hotels. My back has been aching for 40 years. I think it deserves a magnificent mattress. Please have the funds released by Friday." There was a long, sputtering silence, then a sigh of pure, impotent fury. "Fine," he bit out, and he hung up. The mattress was delivered the next week. It was indeed magnificent. I slept for 8 straight hours for the first time in decades. Month after month, the project continued. One weekend a month, we would tackle a room in my apartment. The kitchen cupboards, the linen closet, the dusty space under my bed. And with every object we touched, a story would emerge. A chipped teacup would unleash the story of their father's clumsy but loving attempts to make me breakfast in bed. A faded tablecloth would bring back the memory of a dozen chaotic, happy birthday parties. They were learning their own history, piece by painful piece. And every month, I would submit a new request to the Joyful Noise Trust. A series of symphony tickets. A new, comfortable armchair. An expensive set of watercolor paints, so I could take up a hobby I had dreamed of since I was a girl. Each request was met with a phone call of sputtering rage from Peter and a sigh of weary resignation from Mary. But they always approved the funds. They were legally bound to do so. They were trapped in the gilded cage of my happiness. The turning point, the moment I knew the ice was truly beginning to break, came about 6 months into the project. We were in the kitchen, cleaning out the old recipe box. Mary pulled out a faded, grease-stained index card. On it, in my mother's spidery handwriting, was the recipe for her Hungarian goulash. "Grandma's goulash," Mary said softly. "I haven't thought about this in years. I used to love this so much." "I know," I said. "It was your favorite. I used to make it for your birthday every year." "Why did you stop?" she asked, and for the first time the question was not an accusation, but a genuine inquiry. "Because the ingredients became too expensive, dear," I said simply. "A good cut of beef, the smoked paprika. It became a luxury I couldn't afford after your father died. It was more important to put that money into your savings account." Mary just stared at the recipe card. She traced the faded ink of her grandmother's handwriting with her finger. Then she looked up at me, and her eyes, for the first time, were not filled with resentment or impatience. They were filled with tears. Real tears. "All those years," she whispered, her voice thick with a dawning, horrified understanding. "All those years, we had a steak at our house. We went out for expensive dinners. And you couldn't even afford to make goulash." It was not an apology. It was something more valuable. It was a confession. A confession of an ignorance so profound it was a form of blindness. She wasn't just seeing the recipe card. She was seeing the ghost of the dinners I never ate. She was seeing the cost. That evening, after Peter had gone home, Mary stayed behind. She helped me put the kitchen back in order. "Next weekend," she said, her voice quiet, "can you teach me how to make it, the goulash?" "I would love that, dear," I said. And so, the following Sunday, my daughter and I stood side by side in my small kitchen. I taught her how to brown the beef, how to bloom the paprika, how to make the tiny perfect dumplings her grandmother had taught me to make. The apartment filled with the rich, savory smell of a memory brought back to life. As we ate, a comfortable, easy silence settled between us. It was not the silence of resentment. It was the silence of 2 women who were finally, after a lifetime of misunderstanding, beginning to speak the same language. The project continued for the full year. The stories were written. The house was put in order, and my life bloomed in a riot of joyful, unapologetic color. I took my trip to Maine. I went to Italy. I bought a new color television and a comfortable new armchair. I learned to paint. My small apartment, once a fortress of denial, became a gallery of my own quiet joys. My relationship with my children transformed. It was not a magical overnight change. It was a slow, difficult, and often painful process of rebuilding. There were still moments of resentment, of misunderstanding. But the foundation had shifted. They had been forced to look at the ledger, and they could no longer unsee the cost. They had been forced to listen to the stories, and they could no longer pretend they didn't know the woman who had lived them. The final meeting in Mr. Albright's office, 1 year later, was very different from the first. My children were quiet, somber. They signed the final documents to release the remainder of their inheritance, their hands steady, their eyes clear. There was no impatience, no sighs. There was only a quiet, profound, and hard-won respect. As we were leaving, Peter turned to me. "That trip to Italy, Mom," he said. "The pictures you sent were beautiful. I'm glad you went." "Thank you, Peter," I said. "I am too." It wasn't everything, but it was a start. It was the beginning of a new ledger, one that we would, hopefully, write together. So what is the final lesson for my long and frugal life? It is that love and money are a dangerous cocktail. I thought that by saving money for my children, I was showing them my love. But I was only showing them half the equation. I gave them the gift, but I withheld the story of its cost. And a gift without a story has no real value. It is easily dismissed, easily forgotten. The greatest inheritance I could give them, I learned, was not the money itself, but the understanding of the love that had earned it. I also learned that it is never too late to reclaim your own life. For 50 years, I was the ghost at my own feast, saving every morsel for others. But the moment I decided to sit down and eat, the moment I decided to buy the red coat, I began the process of resurrecting myself. Joy, I have learned, is not a frivolous luxury. It is a vital, necessary, and non-negotiable part of a life well lived. My advice to you, my dear friends, is this. Do not be afraid to show your children the price tags. Not just on the things you buy them, but on the time, the labor, and the love you give them. Teach them that your love is not a free and infinite resource, but a precious, valuable treasure that must be honored and respected. And please, for my sake, do not wait until you are 79 years old to buy the red coat. Buy it now, and wear it with joy. Thank you for being here with me today, for allowing me to share the accounting of my life. Your quiet attention has been the most valuable asset of all. If my story has resonated with you, a like or a subscription to Grandmother's Diary would be a wonderful dividend. Remember to invest in your own joy. It is the only investment that is ever, truly, guaranteed to pay off. Be well and be joyful. I'll see you in the next story. Love, Grandma Agnes.